provide you with the ejection fraction, which is the contractility power or the systolic power of the left ventricle. There are things that we need to be cautious of while we are doing or scanning or performing the CMR pulse sequences that are used for quantitative analysis of valvular heart diseases. First, that any planning has to be perpendicular to the vessel of interest. Usually we use sequence called phase contrast, and I think most of the radiologists are aware of the CSF flowmetry or the MRA, which is the sometimes without contrast. The software will build up a map, and this map could be used in order to measure the flow, so the forward flow and the backward flow in the vessel of interest. And it's important to know, so similar to what we use in Doppler, there is the velocity encoding for a venous protocol or an arterial protocol. And accordingly, the transducer will detect either high velocities or low velocities. So if we adjust it to an arterial protocol, probably the transducer will not look at the venous flow because they are slow. And the opposite, so if we adjust it to a venous flow, probably it will detect the arterial flow as a kind of an aliasing. Similar to the Doppler, the MRI, the phase contrast has to be adjusted beforehand. So we need to tell the software, we need to tell the MRI what is the expected velocity inside. And if it turned out that the velocity exceeds what we have entered before acquisition, then the acquisition will show you some aliasing, which means that the MRI couldn't detect the protons in this pixel because the velocities are much higher than what we said. So how to correct that is to repeat the sequence one more time and do it with a higher velocity. Under breath hold or with breath hold, as a matter of fact, it doesn't matter in this. It's just usually with breath hold, it's much shorter and it's reliable. That's why it's preferred to do it with breath hold, because it's much shorter time. So how do we do the planning of those phase contrast sequences that we used in order to get a flow? So there are two things. There is a transverse, or what we call through plane, and there is what's so-called an in plane. So if you have a line passing through in the short axis that we knew how to plan it, in the basal cut, if the line is passing through the LVOT, this would help you to get a three-chamber view. And why it's called three-chamber view? Because this, as you may see, here's the left ventricle, left atrium, and here's the right ventricle. And if we have, or we could get a line passing through the left ventricle aortic valve inside the ascending thoracic aorta, we could get another view for the left ventricular outflow tract. So now we have two views for the left ventricular outflow tract. Using those two flows, we could use either this or that and do it as a phase contrast sequence. And at that time, we will call it an in plane, as if that the acquisition is parallel to the direction of the blood. So we could see the stenosis, and we could measure the velocities across the valves. And again, as you may see here, because there is a stenosis, the valve is thickened, there is a jet of stenosis. And the jet was creating a velocities higher than what we expected and higher that we have entered. That's why created some aliasing, and repeat of the sequence was needed. An in-plane could provide you with some information about the valve, about the jets of the stenosis and the velocities that we could measure. And if you could measure the Vmax, then we could calculate a pressure gradient. But in MRI, those sequences still are 2D measurements, so they will not provide you with the exact Vmax. So those are the in-plane measurements. There's something called the through-plane measurements. A through-plane means that perpendicular planning to the vessel of interest. For example, in the aorta now, we knew how to get the LVOT coronal or the three-chamber view. And a through-plane would provide you, and this is the net result. This is how it will look like if it's the area of interest is the aorta. Of course, it will provide you, if we do the contouring in the software around the aorta, they will provide you with the upstroke and the backward flow. So it will tell you the forward flow and the amount of the backward flow and the amount of the regurgitation. Similarly, we could do this on every valve. So we could do in plane and through plane. But for example, in the mitral valve, it's sometimes difficult because the plane here is difficult to maintain through the cardiac cycle. The mitral plane moves in systole and diastole forward and backward, so it's kind of difficult to measure it directly through the phase contrast. So usually you could measure it by the indirect method, which is the difference between the stroke volume of the left ventricle and the aorta forward flow. Because the stroke volume is the amount of blood that came outside the left ventricle, but it does not tell you in which direction, whether in the aorta or whether it's back in the atrium. But in a flow sequence, it is the amount of blood that went as a forward flow inside the aorta. So if we subtract the stroke volume in from the contouring, from the cine, from the left ventricle, minus the forward flow in the aorta, then we would be able to measure the amount of regurgitation went back inside the atrium. Or, in a normal subject, the left ventricular stroke volume is similar to the right ventricular stroke volume. So if there is a difference, there are three possibilities. One is that the contouring was wrong. Two is that there is a shunt from left to right or from right to left, which is causing the discrepancy. Or three, that there is a regurgitation on one side. So always when you do the contouring of the left side and right side and you have a discrepancy between the stroke volumes, first revise that your contouring is okay. If it's fine, try to check whether there is any shunts. If not, and it's not the case, then check whether there is a regurgitation or not. Because again, if there is a mitral regurgitation, the left ventricular stroke volume or the measured left ventricular stroke volume is a number that would tell you how much blood came outside the left ventricle, but it does not tell you the direction of the blood. So if there is a regurgitation, then you would expect that the stroke volume from the left ventricle is more than the right ventricle. And subtracting both of them, then this would tell you the amount of the regurgitation.